The restored hum of the environmental node still vibrated through the soles of Mara's boots, a steady and reassuring thrum that replaced the oppressive silence she had arrived to mend. She stood at the center of the calibration platform, her datapad recording the final stabilization metrics with quiet satisfaction. The atmospheric processors were breathing again, drawing in cool, filtered air from the upper canopy layers, while the dormant irrigation channels along the perimeter began their slow, deliberate cycle of moisture distribution. It was a beautiful reminder of what cooperative stewardship could achieve when a system was invited rather than commanded. Yet, as the green status indicators settled into a steady glow across her console, Mara felt the familiar pull of deeper inquiry. The architectural blueprints she had uncovered in the archival shards hinted at a broader design philosophy, one that relied on interconnected networks rather than isolated functions. Her attention naturally drifted downward, past the primary interface housing and toward a heavy access panel set flush with the floor grating near the central support pillar. She knelt, brushing away centuries of fine orbital dust to reveal the seam of a secondary chamber. The metal was cold and unyielding, but Mara knew how to listen for the faintest whisper of residual energy. Placing her gloved palm against the surface, she ran a diagnostic sweep through her harmonizer. A slow, rhythmic pulse responded, though it was buried beneath layers of tectonic displacement. With careful pressure applied along the release hinges, the panel groaned and slid aside, exposing a recessed niche that had long served as the waystation's navigation array housing. The space was dim, shielded from the ambient light that now flooded the upper levels, but her helmet lamps cut through the gloom to reveal rows of crystalline data matrices arranged in a precise orbital lattice. What Mara found within the housing brought her diagnostic sweep to a halt. The primary data crystals were fractured along their longitudinal axes, their internal facets shattered by centuries of subtle tectonic settling that had slowly warped the foundation beneath the interface floor. Each crystal sat at a slight angle, misaligned by mere degrees, but entirely sufficient to scatter any intended signal. They lay inert and dark, their harmonic pathways completely severed from one another. Mara adjusted her spectral analyzer, watching the dead zones where the resonant frequencies should have been dancing. The silence here was absolute, a stark contrast to the living hum still echoing through the environmental node above. She traced the fracture lines with a gloved finger, her mind already mapping the geometric cascade that had occurred over millennia. The builders had designed these matrices to catch and refract complex coordinate data, but without perfect alignment, they were nothing more than decorative stone. She leaned closer, adjusting her magnification lenses to examine the crystal housings. Realignment would require a precise harmonic input, a carefully modulated frequency capable of vibrating the fractured prisms back into their original geometry. It was a task that demanded patience and an exact understanding of resonance thresholds. If she pushed too hard, she risked shattering the remaining structural integrity entirely. The process would involve feeding a calibrated sequence through her harmonizer, allowing the crystals to catch the wave and lock themselves into place one by one. But as Mara initiated a power flow check along the local conduits to prepare for the realignment sequence, a stern reality settled over the readings on her display. The wiring running through the floor grating had suffered severe degradation. Corrosion from long-past moisture seepage had eaten through the conductive plating, and the current capacity of the primary feed lines was less than half what the navigation array required to sustain the realignment load. Mara exhaled slowly, tapping her stylus against her datapad as she cross-referenced the conduit schematics with the array's power demands. The deficit was clear and unyielding. She mapped out a contingency route through the secondary distribution trunk, calculating exactly how much voltage would be required to jump the oxidized gaps without overloading the delicate crystal matrices. Without a stable energy source, the harmonized frequency would falter mid-sequence, leaving the prisms in a worse state of disarray and potentially triggering a cascade failure across the nearby interface housing. She sat back on her heels, studying the darkened crystals and the corroded pathways beneath them. The obstacle was no longer theoretical. It was a tangible gap between her tools and the architecture's needs. Decoding the fragmented transit coordinates would have to wait until she could bridge that power deficit without compromising the delicate harmonic balance she had just restored. The hum of the stabilized canopy vibrated through the floor grating, a steady thrum that marked the boundary between silence and life. Mara followed the thick, insulated bundles of conduit that disappeared into the dark throat of the navigation array housing. Her fingers brushed against the cold plating, tracing routes until they narrowed into a secondary junction box wedged behind a collapsed support strut. The box was scarred by time, bearing the pockmarks of long-forgotten micro-impacts, but its structural integrity held. She pried the access panel loose with her multi-tool, revealing a dense mesh of legacy wiring and ceramic insulators. A quick diagnostic sweep confirmed her suspicion. The array's primary draw far exceeded the dormant reserves buried within this housing, which had been siphoned by slow leakage over decades. To wake the navigation system, she would need a robust feed. The only viable path lay in tapping into the newly stabilized canopy environmental grid. She worked with deliberate care, routing a flexible coupling from the junction box back toward the interface node she had just awakened. The builder's adaptive architecture meant the connection had to be invited rather than forced. A crude merge would cause the systems to reject one another. Mara adjusted the flow regulators on her coupler, matching her tap to the grid's natural breathing rhythm. She listened for the harmonic acceptance, feeling the subtle shift in resistance as the canopy recognized the request. She checked the harmonic drift, ensuring her intervention remained within the narrow band of acceptance the grid allowed for external inputs. Slowly, the amber lights on the secondary box shifted to steady green. Power flowed smoothly, drawing just enough from the environmental systems to feed the array without disrupting the delicate ecological balance she had restored. The hum deepened slightly as the navigation housing drew breath, and Mara verified the load capacity was sufficient for calibration work. With energy secured, Mara turned her attention to the heart of the problem, the fractured data crystals. They lay scattered across the primary tray like broken glass, their internal lattices misaligned by centuries of tectonic settling. The array was alive with potential, but unable to interpret its own memories. To decode the fragmented transit coordinates, she needed context beyond this derelict shell. She pulled her datapad from her belt and jacked into the hardline conduit that snaked down through the waystation's spine toward the settlement archives below. The connection hummed against her wrist, a familiar sensation of bridging gaps across time. The terminal screen flickered to life, resolving rows of local settlement logs. Mara scrolled past centuries of weather reports and agricultural yields until she found the historical transit manifests. These records, maintained by the remote settlements who once relied on this orbital node for coordination, spoke of a cooperative network rather than a command structure. She began cross-referencing the logs with the array's fragmented output codes. The codes were not random. They were displacement vectors masked by decay and noise. Overlapping the settlement data revealed a ghost of a pattern. The coordinates shifted in response to celestial alignments and planetary drift, requiring specific harmonic intervals to unlock the stored routes. Mara noted the required alignment sequences, her mind mapping the complex interplay of angles and frequencies needed to reassemble the fractured path. However, applying this sequence directly risked shattering the fragile crystals or triggering another counter-harmonic feedback loop. The builders had designed systems to adapt, not to withstand brute force. Mara set her datapad aside and reached for her tool roll. She laid out a collection of salvaged tuning forks, each calibrated to specific resonant frequencies used by the original architects. Beside them sat her manual resonance calibrator, a device she had refined over years of solitary repairs, its casing worn smooth by use. She secured the calibration rig near the array tray, ensuring the dampeners were set to maximum sensitivity. Using the tuning forks, she tested pure tones against the visible stress fractures in the crystals. The goal was to design a low-amplitude input sequence that could nudge the lattices back into alignment without exceeding their structural tolerance. She recorded the responses, adjusting her calibrator's output waveform step by step. The sequence required a gentle crescendo of harmonic phases, mirroring the adaptive partnership she had witnessed in the canopy. She drafted the parameters, ensuring the phase angles would guide rather than dominate, allowing the fractured crystals to find their own center. The draft was complete, a delicate map of sound that honored the machine's need for cooperation over command. Mara verified the safety margins once more, her hands steady. She had secured a viable power source and drafted a safe alignment sequence, preparing for direct array engagement with confidence that the path forward respected the legacy she was uncovering. The temporary bypass cable hummed with quiet anticipation as Mara secured the final coupling. She had spent the preceding hours drafting the alignment sequence, cross-referencing salvaged tuning fork frequencies with hardline transit logs until the theoretical mathematics settled into a practical rhythm. Now, standing before the navigation array housing, she engaged the repurposed harmonic resonator. It no longer fought against counter-harmonic feedback. Instead, it acted as a gentle conduit, channeling the stabilized energy from the environmental grid directly into the maintenance port. The connection felt secure, a deliberate bridge between centuries of dormancy and the careful intention of the present moment. Mara initiated the sequence. A low-amplitude pulse traveled through the cable, entering the array's core with measured grace. Inside the fractured crystal matrix, dormant geometry began to stir. She watched through the primary viewport as the misaligned prisms caught the calibrated harmonic input. Slowly, deliberately, they shifted. Each facet caught the ambient light and redirected it, clicking softly into its designated coordinate. The process was meticulous, a mechanical ballet governed by centuries-old logic. Mara tracked the progression against her mental map of the alignment sequence, noting how each resolved crystal reduced the acoustic friction in the housing. The air around her grew warmer, carrying the faint scent of ozone and polished stone. The builders had designed these systems to adapt rather than dictate, and the initial response confirmed that philosophy. Then the shift changed. The crystals locked into their intended positions with a sudden, resonant chime that vibrated through the floor grating. But instead of the expected cascade of activation, the array's aging logic gates registered the harmonic intrusion as an unauthorized override. A warning tone, low and metallic, echoed from within the housing. The system's protective subroutines had been triggered, interpreting the precise calibration as a breach rather than a restoration. Heavy shielding plates, dormant since the station's final departure, groaned and slid into place over the interface. The primary viewport darkened instantly, severing Mara's direct monitoring tools from their feed. Digital readouts flickered and died, leaving her in a sudden, quiet stillness. She did not panic. Instead, she adjusted her posture, leaning closer to the now-sealed housing. Without visual data, she had to trust the other senses that decades of fieldwork had honed. Mara pressed a gloved hand against the cool metal plating, closing her eyes to listen. The acoustic resonance told its own story. Beneath the mechanical clatter of the locking plates, she could still hear the faint, lingering hum of the bypass cable. It carried the subtle tremors of the crystals settling into their new alignment. Every click and harmonic shift translated through the metal into her palm, a tactile language of progress and resistance. She followed the vibrations with deliberate breaths, mapping the array's internal state by feel rather than sight. The metal grew warmer as the system cycled its internal diagnostics, each pulse offering a new layer of information. Mara noted the subtle changes in resistance against her palm, translating the mechanical adjustments into a mental schematic. Every resolved fracture reduced the harmonic drag, allowing the bypass cable to carry a cleaner signal deeper into the housing. The containment protocol had complicated the immediate process, but it had not halted it. The system was simply enforcing its original safety parameters, demanding a slower, more patient negotiation. Mara adjusted the output on the resonator, dialing back the amplitude slightly to match the new acoustic profile. She listened for the telltale drop in frequency that signaled successful gate acknowledgement, feeling for the smooth transition from friction to fluid resonance. The work required her to become part of the interface, translating machine logic through touch and sound until the protective barriers recognized her presence as stewardship rather than intrusion. Outside the sealed housing, the environmental grid continued its steady pulse, a quiet reminder that the resources were available and the path forward remained open. She stood in the dim light, hand resting against the metal, waiting for the next harmonic shift to guide her toward the decoded coordinates. The heavy shielding plates pressed against Mara's shoulders, sealing her inside a pocket of stale air and humming resistance. Behind her palms, the navigation array's logic gates threw up a wall of rigid impedance. Her manually drafted alignment sequence hammered against it, but the feedback was sharp, unyielding. She had assumed the containment protocol was a defensive firewall, a digital lock designed to keep unauthorized hands from tampering with centuries-old hardware. But as she traced the waveform on her wrist display, the pattern shifted beneath her fingers. The impedance wasn't attacking, it was bracing. It was holding the structure tight against a stress it knew the current input couldn't survive. Forcing the alignment would shear the fractured crystal lattice entirely, turning months of careful salvage into inert dust. Mara exhaled slowly, letting her shoulders drop away from the cold metal. The realization settled over her with the quiet certainty of a completed circuit. The builders had never designed systems to be conquered. They built them to listen. Cooperative stewardship was not a slogan archived in some forgotten server. It was the operating principle etched into every gear and resonance chamber on this station. She needed to stop commanding the machine and start conversing with it. She reached back along the temporary bypass cable, her fingers finding the dampening dial on her harmonic resonator. With deliberate care, she reduced the amplitude of her dominant frequency, stripping away the rigid cadence she had forced into the alignment sequence. She closed her eyes and listened to the ambient hum of the stabilized canopy grid tapping into the array's secondary junction box. Instead of fighting the resistance, she matched it. She modulated her output to mirror the dormant adaptive rhythm hidden beneath the containment lock, a slow, breathing cadence that asked for permission rather than demanding entry. For several long moments, nothing changed but the subtle shift in vibration through her boots. Then, the rigid impedance softened. The array recognized the invitation. A series of soft hydraulic sighs echoed from the ceiling as the heavy shielding plates retracted, sliding back into their tracks to reveal the dimly lit chamber beyond. Mara opened her eyes and stepped forward, peering past the maintenance port. Inside the primary housing, the fractured data crystals began to move. They did not snap violently into place. They drifted with the grace of floating leaves on a steady current. Each shard rotated along its natural axis, guided by the adaptive rhythm Mara was now sustaining. The clicks were precise and rhythmic, a mechanical percussion that gradually resolved into a single, unified harmonic tone. The sound filled the chamber, warm and resonant, carrying the weight of centuries of dormancy lifting all at once. As the crystals settled, the power draw on the bypass conduit steadied, the fluctuating load smoothing into a consistent, sustainable pulse. Mara watched the tactile display flicker back to life as the logic gates fully accepted the adaptive input. The fragmented transit coordinates, previously scattered across disjointed memory sectors, began to coalesce. Lines of light wove together on her screen, mapping out trajectories that stretched beyond the orbital way station's original parameters. She traced the emerging pathways with a gentle touch, noting how each coordinate shared the same foundational architecture, the same quiet emphasis on preservation rather than control. The navigation array was not merely recalibrating its own position, it was drawing up a ledger of connections, a web of routes that had been waiting for a cooperative hand to complete the circuit. She leaned back against the workbench, letting the unified harmonic tone vibrate through the soles of her boots. The containment protocol was gone, replaced by a steady, open channel of data. Mara made a quiet note in her personal log, acknowledging the shift from isolation to integration. She adjusted the bypass conduit's gain to match the newly stabilized draw, ensuring the system would continue to thrive without strain. The fractured transit map glowed softly in the dim light, promising journeys yet to be mapped and communities yet to be reached through the quiet cooperation of machine and steward alike. The harmonic stabilizer settled into its cradle with a soft metallic click, and Mara withdrew her hands from the maintenance port. The adaptive calibration was complete. For several quiet heartbeats, the navigation array housing remained suspended in that delicate threshold between dormant and active, the fractured crystals within its core slowly rotating into their final alignments. Then, a low harmonic hum vibrated through the floor plates, resonating up through the soles of her boots. It carried none of the sharp demand of a command override, but rather a warm, steady pulse that perfectly mirrored the stabilized rhythm of the canopy environmental grid above. The aging logic gates recognized the cooperative input and opened without hesitation. The temporary bypass cable glowed faintly as the load capacity stabilized, feeding just enough power to awaken the sleeping architecture. Light bloomed from the crystal lattice until it cast a three-dimensional star chart across the interface chamber. The projection hovered in the center of the room, mapping dormant way stations across multiple sectors. Mara stepped back as the coordinates coalesced into a coherent transit pattern. Each node connected by sweeping arcs of adaptive routing data demonstrated how the original architects had woven infrastructure across vast distances without ever forcing convergence. The map did not radiate from a single capital world or demand loyalty to a central hub. Instead, it branched outward like mycelial threads, prioritizing ecological balance and regional autonomy above all else. The projection shifted slowly, rotating on a silent axis to reveal depth that flat schematics had never captured. She moved to the nearby survey console and pulled up local geological records on the display. Cross-referencing the projected waypoints with centuries of tectonic logs revealed a remarkably deliberate pattern. The way stations were positioned precisely along natural fault lines and deep aquifer boundaries, never disrupting existing watersheds or forcing planetary resources into rigid extraction cycles. Mara traced a glowing arc on the holographic interface, watching how the routing algorithms adjusted dynamically to seasonal shifts and atmospheric changes. She adjusted the frequency filters on her console to match the planetary baselines, ensuring every data point aligned with the local tectonic drift. The builders had not engineered a system of control. They had designed a framework of partnership. Every coordinate confirmed that adaptive stewardship was not merely a philosophical preference, but a structural necessity baked into the very geometry of the network. With a quiet exhale, Mara opened her personal archive terminal. Her fingers danced across the physical keyboard, capturing the full coordinate matrix in real time. She ran a standard encryption protocol, then established a secure backup link to her off-world storage drives. The data streamed smoothly across the hardline, each waypoint verified and locked into place. The encryption keys cycled through multiple layers, guaranteeing that the archival records would remain intact for decades of future calibration work. As the progress indicator reached completion, she formally archived the decoding sequence, labeling the file with the sector designation and timestamp. The immediate objective had been met. The fragmented transit coordinates were no longer scattered fragments of forgotten history, but a coherent map ready for exploration. She powered down the temporary bypass conduit, carefully coiling the cabling back into its storage spool. The navigation array continued to cycle through its diagnostic harmonics, a steady reminder that the network was alive and waiting. Mara packed her tuning forks into her field kit, feeling the familiar weight of purpose settle in her chest. This verification was only the beginning. The distributed infrastructure pattern, confirmed across multiple dormant way stations, meant that every subsequent repair would be part of a much larger tapestry. She made a mental note to cross-reference the transit arcs with upcoming settlement schedules. Mara secured her field kit against her shoulder and moved toward the exit corridor. Every coordinate mapped would bring them closer to understanding how the original builders intended their legacy to flourish. The legacy of optimistic stewardship was no longer an abstract concept. It was a working map, and Mara Venn was ready to follow its lines. The interface chamber settled into a steady, low-frequency hum as Mara stepped back from the console. The three-dimensional star chart still hovered in the air for a few lingering moments before the projection gates dimmed, leaving only the archival data securely logged in the navigation array. She had done it. The fractured crystals were realigned, the logic gates were accepting adaptive input without resistance, and the sector-wide transit map was no longer a collection of fragmented codes, but a coherent picture of interconnected way stations. She took a slow breath, letting the quiet of the room wash over her before pushing open the heavy interface doors. Sunlight poured across the terrace in warm, golden sheets, catching on centuries of weathered stone and rusted support beams. The air felt different now, lighter and sweeter, with the scent of damp soil and blooming canopy vines. Below the way station, the cultivated terraces were already responding to the renewed environmental flow. Pale green shoots pushed through the dark earth along the irrigation channels, and the dormant windscreens had begun to sway in a gentle, coordinated rhythm. The ecological restoration was not a sudden miracle, but a quiet unwinding of centuries-old tension. She watched a cluster of native pollinators drift past the stone railings, their wings catching the light as they moved toward the newly watered soil. It was exactly what the original architects had intended, leaving behind systems that adapted rather than dictated, waiting for cooperative stewardship to breathe life back into forgotten places. The machinery did not demand obedience. It simply offered a foundation upon which life could reclaim its natural balance. Mara pulled her field tablet from her belt and opened a secure channel to the Regional Stewardship Council. Her fingers moved methodically across the glass interface as she drafted the progress report. She kept the tone professional but warm, acknowledging the local maintenance crews who had cleared access routes decades ago. The message highlighted the successful calibration of the navigation array and emphasized how the newly confirmed transit network would allow future engineers to share resources across dormant way stations without overburdening any single ecosystem. Within moments, a response chimed softly on her tablet. A senior council steward replied with gratitude and an invitation to coordinate long-term monitoring schedules. The bond between Mara and the remote settlements remained strong, built on mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than top-down directives. They understood that knowledge traveled best when carried together, and this network would serve as a living archive for generations to come. She turned back toward the interface chamber to gather her equipment. The harmonic resonator sat coiled on a workbench where she had temporarily repurposed it as a bypass conduit for calibration. It would be returned to its proper housing once the broader network diagnostics were complete. Mara packed her salvaged tuning forks, hardline transit logs, and micro-adjustment drivers into their reinforced cases with practiced efficiency. Every tool found its designated slot, the familiar weight of the kit grounding her after hours of delicate work. She was documenting the ecological restoration alongside the technical achievements, knowing that both threads would be vital for the council long-term planning. As she fastened the final latch on her equipment case, a faint pulse echoed through the chamber floor. Mara paused, listening closely to the subtle shift in the ambient frequency. The signal originated from one of the newly mapped coordinates, projecting outward along the transit network with quiet precision. She pulled up the diagnostic overlay on her tablet and tracked the source. It was an environmental signature that closely matched her current planet, carrying atmospheric data and soil resonance patterns that felt deeply familiar. Yet beneath the recognizable baseline lay a distinct harmonic variance, a subtle divergence in the frequency bands that suggested either localized adaptation or a secondary calibration layer still waiting to be engaged. She logged the anomaly with careful notation, marking it as an unexplained variable for future investigation. The transit network was expanding, and with every pulse of data, the original architect's legacy grew clearer, pointing toward a vast, cooperative stewardship that extended far beyond a single world.